Hello you guys, and welcome to my channel. Today's video we are going to talk all about my birth experience with my son Riker. I'm making a video like this simply because when I was pregnant I found them to be massively helpful, and I'm hoping that it will be helpful for you as well. I think that learning about birth, especially if it's your first pregnancy, is so valuable, and filling your mind with such positive information about pregnancy and delivery is really important, because a lot of times you hear a lot of fearsome stories, and so you go into the whole experience with that mentality, which I think can kind of complicate things. So I'm gonna break my video up into different sections. I'll timestamp it in the comments down below, so you can feel free to kind of hop to whatever is relevant to you. But basically we're gonna talk about my labor, my delivery, and then recovery, and then at the very end of the video I'll have a section solely about advice that I found personally beneficial for my whole experience. I'm also going to say that I'm by no means a professional when it comes to pregnancy, labor, or delivery. This is just simply my experience. This is everything that worked for myself personally, and I'm hoping that it'll work and apply for some of you guys as well. So before I go into detail about my labor and delivery, I want to preface this story by saying that I wanted to have an unmedicated birth, not necessarily because I'm against using anesthesia or painkillers of any sort, but it's more just because I had this sort of gut instinct from the get-go of my pregnancy that I could deliver this child without that sort of intervention. I have nothing against people who opt for it. I think it's totally great that we have it as an option. I just personally sort of had this draw towards a different direction. Plain and simple. So my labor started at an inconclusive time, basically. On the 12th of March, I called my midwife because I felt like I couldn't feel my child moving as much as he normally does. So they told me to go into the labor and delivery department of the hospital that I plan to deliver at and perform an NST test, a non-stress test, just to kind of get the fetal heart rate, check my blood pressure, just kind of see how everything is going. Everything looked really great on all the tests that came back for both the child and for myself. However, upon further check, so we did a blood test and then they checked for my dilation, they found out that I was 4 or 5 centimeters dilated already. Mind you, I hadn't felt a single thing. I felt completely normal. That day I had even done a 2-mile aerobic walk. And felt no cramping, no sort of difference. Because the midwives didn't know when I started to dilate, and because I was showing signs of preeclampsia, they decided that it was best if I was admitted to the hospital that night with the intention of being induced to kind of speed up my contractions because I wasn't feeling anything. My lack of pain was actually hugely baffling to the entire hospital staff. They said that they hadn't encountered a birth like that before, at least not in their hospital, which is understandable because I also haven't really heard of something like that before, to be honest with you. I just genuinely did not feel anything. With that being said, I was terrified when they told me that I needed to be admitted. I was panicked because we weren't ready at all. Ryan and I didn't have our hospital bags packed or anything. So later in the evening, my parents came over, my sister came over to the hospital, and then Ryan went home to go pick up all of the hospital bag stuff, which, side note, if you would like a video on what we brought in our hospital bag, let me know in the comments down below and I'll make sure to record that for you guys, because what you pack to the hospital, I feel like, is super important to make sure you kind of set the mood and are prepared for that delivery. So we slept through the night. I wanted to see how my body naturally would progress on its own potentially. But when I woke up the next morning, we hadn't really progressed. One labor and delivery nurse said that, oh, actually you were around a 5 or a 6 right now as opposed to a 4 or 5. But then the next nurse crew came over with the midwives and they said, no, actually you're not, you're still at a 4 or 5 basically. which sparked a lot of fear in people because, again, we still had no idea when I started to even dilate in the first place, how long I had been at a 4 or 5. And so they said we need to basically get the show on the road. And so they gave a very low dose of a drug called Pitocin, which is something that basically strengthens and induces contractions. I was pretty apprehensive about taking the Pitocin. I had heard some weird stories about it, to be honest with you, that it can make the contractions go really powerful, really close together. It doesn't give your uterus a break, and that it can kind of like flare things up. Essentially, I had an okay experience with it. I was not bothered by it until I was about, let's see, maybe about 9 centimeters. I truthfully was still okay. I was able to walk around. Don't get me wrong, I felt sensations, I felt discomfort, but I was still able to walk. I was still able to talk until I was about 9 centimeters, and then I was like, it's go time, buddy. We gotta get this baby out. Up until about 7 centimeters, I was walking with like my little IV drip up and down the hallways, which the nurses apparently, I found out afterwards, thought was like pretty amazing and hysterical because they literally just don't see that typically. Alrighty, we're about 6 or 7 dilated right now. Centimeters dilated and super effaced according to the nurse here, so everything's going super well. Yeah. Just kind of sleepy more than anything else, but feeling really, really great and excited.
Yeah, it's a little after 7 a.m. We came in about 7:30 last night. What's today, the 13th?
Today's the 13th now.
13th, yeah, so we came in last night on the 12th.
Yeah, I had no idea, but I was already like 4 or 5 centimeters dilated when we came in.
Yeah.
So we just came in for like a little checkup, but guess we were in labor.
Yeah, and everything's going great.
Yes.
She's doing well. The nurses and doctors and midwife are all very happy, and she's doing great.
Yay. I'm not sure if I was able to remain so active in the pregnancy, in the labor, because of how active I was in the pregnancy, or what kind of attributed to that. However, I felt good. Once I hit more of an active labor stage, I noticed that my legs and primarily my legs, but it was almost like my entire body started to kind of like quiver or shake. I was told that's because of the different hormones that are being rapidly changing within your body, essentially, as well as the adrenaline. The shaking for me lasted about up until 4 or 5 days post-delivery as well. It wasn't constant, but it was kind of like whenever anything either like mildly stressed me out or was kind of, honestly, it was kind of random. Even like one time I literally just went up to go urinate and started shaking and had to get back in bed and bundle up basically until it stopped. So my water broke on its own when I was about 7 or 8 centimeters dilated. They opted not to rupture my water bag simply because they found it to be very vascular and they didn't want it to cause any sort of an issue. It didn't hurt at all when my water broke. It was quite warm, and to be honest with you, I thought I was like urinating. It was nothing like a huge gush that you typically see in the movies or on television shows. It was more like a steady stream than anything else. And the way that I knew that it was my water was because you can't stop the liquid from coming out when your water is breaking, as you can like with your urine, for example. Another interesting thing I learned about labor, according to one of the labor and delivery nurses, is she said that if you have more painful menstrual cycles, that you'll perceive the pain of labor and delivery as less than somebody who has, for example, like totally blissfully painless periods. So it could also be that I regularly have very painful menstrual cycles. It's just kind of like what I am personally used to, and therefore I was better able to handle labor and delivery. I'm not quite sure. Before I even went into labor and delivery, I prepared a lot, both physically and mentally, for the whole thing because I was quite nervous, and I immersed myself with as much information as humanly possible, especially in the 3rd trimester. I was listening to like hypnobirthing every single night, but I'll get more into that later in this video. I think a good example of what contractions felt like for myself personally was not necessarily like a cramp, like a muscle cramp or anything like that, but it was more like a tightening sensation that kind of occurred from like both top and bottom as well as side to side, kind of simultaneously. But again, I think everyone experiences it differently. Sometimes I also felt it in my lower back, in which case kind of like that counter pressure was really helpful. So if you have a partner, a midwife, or somebody in the room to kind of like push the hips in essentially, I'm not quite sure how that helps precisely, but it does. Moving on to the delivery part. This was actually my favorite part of the entire process, which is so ironic because I was also quite terrified of it at a certain point as well. I threw up about 3 times during the process, which might seem like a lot or a little, I'm not quite sure, but in any case, it was primarily water that I was getting rid of, just because that day I hadn't really had any appetite, which is not very good. Probably you should be eating more during that whole process, but it's kind of like, you know, you don't really want to sit down and have a cheeseburger when you're kind of like about to deliver a baby. I'm not sure, like somehow it just really decreased my appetite. And so I basically just had applesauce, some water, and some very bad hospital oatmeal. When I began to push, this is the part of the entire process that I had the most fear kind of built up within myself, but it actually turned out to be one of the most relieving portions of the entire process. I was most afraid basically of like tearing or having to be cut or have stitches or something like that, which in the end I needed none of that, which is miraculous and amazing and fantastic. But the reason why I enjoyed it so much is because you were able to push when you're getting the contractions. At least that's how it was for me. And for some reason, when you were pushing with the contractions, you didn't feel the discomfort of the typical, you know, active stage of labor contractions. You didn't feel that as much at all. It felt really good. It felt like what you were supposed to be doing. I've heard a lot of people describe the pushing part of labor as kind of like you're getting close when you feel like you're split in half or when you feel like you have a ring of fire. I personally can't relate to either of those. I didn't feel that at all, and I kept trying to like engage myself like, okay, when I feel like I'm splitting in half or when I feel like I'm burning, that means I'm getting close. It never happened. It felt more like a general sort of like pressure than anything else. It felt like a process that my body was quite literally able to do. It didn't feel alien. It didn't feel unnatural. It felt completely normal and capable. When I was pushing, I had my sister over on one of my sides. My eyes were shut basically the entire time because when you're in the active part of this whole process, you truly do have sort of like an outer body experience, and it's not necessarily in a bad way or in a fearful way. It just is kind of like you're so focused on everything that's kind of like going on. Your body literally just kind of takes over the whole process for you. I mean, don't get me wrong, you are the one pushing, you are like the whole vessel for it all, but your body kind of just kicks in and it kind of takes over a lot of these things where you're not even necessarily thinking, you're just kind of reacting. So I had my mom and sister holding my knees basically to my chin as high as I could, and then I had Ryan off to my side basically telling me, you know, that I was doing great and to remind me to keep breathing. And I can't remember everything else that he was saying, but everyone was just very, very supportive and got me through this whole experience. It was really crazy actually, because towards the end, when you're kind of like starting to get like a little bit tired of pushing and kind of like going through like this whole process, you get, of course, a bit exhausted. And towards the end, I was able to touch the head of my child when he wasn't fully out. And it was the most surreal experience ever. Not only because, you know, you feel the little guy coming out, but it's like he's all slimy and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm getting so close. I can do this. I can do this. And it really just kind of like, you should ask whoever is helping you deliver if they can do that for you, because I swear it will just amp up your push game real strong. So now moving on to recovery. Immediately after my little guy came out, I felt drastically different instantaneously, essentially. I felt really, really good. Any sort of discomfort that I had been feeling leading up to that moment had completely dissipated. The labor and delivery nurse had offered me some apple juice and some graham crackers, and to be quite honest with you, it sounded like the most heavenly combination of food I had ever heard of in my life, and it was fantastic.
I remember when she offered that to you, like the look in your eyes, it's like you just won the lottery. You're like, yes.
Well, I was so like out of it too, and I was just like, how does she know I like graham crackers? I thought she was like messing with me.
Applesauce.
Exactly, I know. I mean, it was fantastic. But speaking about the hospital food, I also had like a hummus plate for dinner with carrots, cucumbers, some pita bread, more applesauce, and then the hospital that I delivered at delivered fresh cookies every single day at 3 p.m. So I also had, I think, 1 chocolate chip cookie or 2. 2? They were really good. Fun fact, I've made that same hummus plate, or not that same one, but a hummus plate inspired by that meal probably at least 3 times since coming home from the hospital. I love it. Within 1 to 2 hours after I delivered, I was up and I was able to walk around, not on my own, of course, because they want to make sure that you don't like pass out due to, I mean, the changes that are happening to your body. They kind of supervise you for that time. But I was able to move, I was able to feel totally okay, and I was mobile.
It's the morning after delivery. It's been about 12 hours since I gave birth to this little cutie, and I'm feeling really great. I didn't have any tears, I didn't have any stitches, and bleeding is under control for sure. He's doing really well. Also, he's had some issues with spitting up, and so they think he swallowed some amniotic fluid, so just trying to keep him vertical or on his side and then kind of continually burping him. But we were all able to get some sleep, which is typical for the first night. I've heard the second night is a little bit more restless, so we'll see how that goes, but so far super good.
I think the shaking sensation was most intense for the recovery during the first 2 days post-delivery, and I found staying warm to kind of help mediate that sort of sensation at a quicker rate than if you were to just kind of be like, mind over matter, let's stop shaking now, basically. I remember one of the things that I was most glad about in terms of the recovery or post-delivery was having that darn IV removed. It's right there. Because we were admitted that same night that I took the NST test, we stayed there for 3 nights, but we stayed a total of 2 nights post-delivery. I think overall the hospital was a really great experience. I did want to have a home birth initially, but I think given my unforeseen complications, honestly, it was the best decision for myself to deliver in that setting. Moving on to the advice section. The number one piece of advice that I can give you that I will definitely do if I'm ever pregnant again is to stay calm as possible. Do not stress during this time and stay excited about it. One way that really helped me not only get a better sleep, but sort of feel mentally like I'm preparing myself for this huge marathon, essentially, was listening to hypnobirthing. I specifically found the tracks from Tracy Holloway. I'll link to her in the description box down below. I found them to be essential, and ever since I found her, I listened to her tracks on basically a replay playlist every single night when I was going to bed. Gosh, I think it started at least in the start of the 3rd trimester. And at first I was kind of like so skeptical. I was like, hypnobirthing, really? Like, what are we gonna do? Like a little clock back and forth and I'm just gonna like fall into a peaceful little trance or something? It's not like that. I swear they literally are just infusing you with positive thoughts essentially about the entire process and reinforcing the fact that you can do this and that it's gonna be okay and that you will be okay and everything will be okay. Once you hit a more active point of labor, I highly suggest that you sort of start to vocalize. When I say vocalize, I mean sort of like, instead of like holding in any sort of like sensation that you're experiencing, like what I found to be personally helpful and something that I couldn't even stop, for example, was just hooing almost. I know some people like growl or make all sorts of noises. For me, it was like, ooh, like it was kind of like something that was happening, kind of like a lower, consistent, rhythmic sort of sound that was kind of coming from myself. I found it to be sort of, I guess, helpful in a way to kind of have that sort of continuous melody coming out while I was in delivery. Another thing I had, playing during the entire time of me being in labor, maybe not towards the active point of labor, but throughout like the earlier stages before I was like pushing, for example, was the hypnobirthing tracks. It was nice to kind of have that sort of like familiar track playing that I had been listening to months or weeks in advance, kind of coming back into play during, well, the grand finale, essentially. In the delivery room, I had my essential oil diffuser with me. I diffused clary sage essential oil for a couple weeks leading up to delivery, as well as during the entire process, as well as during my recovery. Basically, the entire time I was at the hospital, I was diffusing clary sage essential oil. I've heard people say that they can help with contractions. I personally just like the smell. I find it to be very soothing and pleasant. Another one I've heard is really good is jasmine. That's supposed to be really good for you as well. Lavender, of course, is very calming. And a nice citrus, like a tangerine or so, is supposed to be really good and uplifting as well. I also just liked it just because I'm not too fond of like the medicinal scent or the hospital scent. It kind of puts like a weird butterfly sensation in my stomach. And so having that sort of like alternative scent really helped make the atmosphere a bit more familiar, especially because I had been smelling it at home for so long beforehand. Another thing that I found helpful is that when you already have delivered the baby, if you put like a moist towelette, essentially of witch hazel, above the pad that you're going to be wearing, it really kind of helps expedite the healing process. And if you developed any sort of hemorrhoids during the pushing, for example, or if you had any from during the pregnancy, this will help kind of alleviate any sort of discomfort. I also really suggest that you get a little squirt bottle as well. If you fill it up with warm water, and then every time you go to use the restroom, you kind of wash yourself down, essentially, it not only will make you feel better, but it will allow the area to kind of heal a bit faster as well, because it's being maintained, it's being cleansed. And yeah, if you have a lot of discomfort, I also highly suggest you ask about receiving a lidocaine spray. I personally found this to be even more helpful than any sort of like a Motrin or something like that. You apply it directly to the area that you're experiencing discomfort in, and it'll essentially numb it or minimize it nearly instantaneously, which is really helpful in the first couple days post-delivery. While we're on the topic of bathroom stuff, do not wipe when you are freshly delivered. Pat yourself dry. Another thing about the bathroom, going number 2 post-delivery is something that I'm pretty sure every woman fears just a little bit. As I said, I didn't have any stitches and I was still a bit fearful of going to the bathroom. One way to kind of help with that, I found, is to eat prunes. They're fantastic. They're really beneficial. Let's be honest, they're not like the most deliciously amazing thing in the world, but I think they're more effective than even stool softeners because they kind of do everything all in one. And you can just integrate it in your normal diet, like have a couple prunes for breakfast, pop 3 in your, oatmeal or something like that and call it a day. You'll be you'll be good. Another thing to sort of help speed up the healing process and potentially alleviate any sort of sensation of constipation is to take an Epsom salt bath. Some days post-recovery, I took up to 2 baths in a day, just because I found it to be very relaxing. I found it to really alleviate a lot of discomfort that I may have been feeling for a couple hours post-bath even. The idea with it alleviating constipation, apparently, from what I recall, is that it's supposed to kind of relax those muscles that sort of tighten, allowing you to have a bit more ease, if that makes sense. As far as advice for before pregnancy, I highly suggest that you think about what type of delivery you want to have. Like, what is your ideal scenario for your delivery? And then subsequently, I suggest that you go check out multiple different hospitals and do their tour. I did the tour at the hospital that I delivered at twice. Once when I was kind of like generally looking around and informing myself about the whole entire process of pregnancy and delivery. And then later when I was about somewhere in my late 3rd trimester, so about a week or 2 or 3 before delivery, just to kind of do like another run so I was not like, where do I go? Which really helps. Some other advice is to stay active during your pregnancy. You can do low impact, still aerobic workouts. I found the Leslie Sansone Walk Away the Pounds tapes to be really good. I started at about like a 3-mile one, but then as the pregnancy progressed, I went down to about a 1-mile one. And if you want to do more than 1 mile, for example, what I found really helpful is if you do like, because the 1-mile sections are about 15 minutes long. So if you did like, if you did 1 mile in the morning and then another mile perhaps in the late evening, if you had that energy and that desire, you can. I found that to be a bit easier than doing it in bulk, for example, in the later stages of pregnancy. But I think walking and kind of staying on the bouncy ball and doing stretches is essential. I would definitely suggest that. Something that I didn't do but that you could do is apply coconut oil to yourself. I didn't do this, I'm not quite sure why exactly. It just, like, I had the coconut oil, I just never really found myself grabbing it and applying it. What I found to be very helpful though is during the pushing session of labor, having your delivery person essentially apply oil to you at that point, I feel like is hugely important, and it's something that you should probably ask your midwife or whoever, or your OB, whoever's helping you, ask if they do that. I know my midwife had basically a squirt bottle full of lubricant for myself and was, very vigorously applying it towards the later stages. And I think that honestly is what saved me from having any sort of tears or damage down there. I think it probably reduced any sort of potential pain or additional discomfort that I could have felt during that time. So some delivery advice aside from the oil, I also highly suggest, if you can, to pool when you're pushing. That sort of polarizing motion where it's like you're actively pushing and actively pulling somehow really helps to focus your energy up here as well as down here. I don't know, I'm not describing it very well, but just take my word for it. If you're struggling to kind of like get that extra oomph, just reach your arm out to anybody, whether it's a labor and delivery nurse, your husband, your grandchild. I don't know why it would be your grandchild actually. But just reach your arm out to somebody and kind of pull back and forth type of thing. It will help. Another thing to help with pushing, I'm not sure if this is normal or not. This is something that you might want to ask your midwife or whoever is helping you deliver. This might sound weird, stay with me here. But if you ask them to sort of like apply pressure to your birth canal while you're pushing, it will help you immensely focus on where you should be pushing. Because when I first started, honestly, I didn't know how to push. It wasn't instantaneous for myself personally. And so feeling kind of like, you know, like, okay, this is where it needs to go, and kind of pushing with that sensation helped tremendously. And if you feel like you're struggling to kind of like focus on where you should be pushing, ask for that. My last piece of pushing advice essentially is to drink water a lot during your contractions or in between your contractions. What I've heard is that if you're not properly hydrating, it can actually amplify the discomfort that you would be feeling, because your uterus is like a big old muscle. And so when a muscle is dehydrated, it really kind of cramps up more and it doesn't feel very good. But also, you are going to be exerting so much energy during this whole process that you'll really need to be staying hydrated, and you'll be wanting that water anyways and needing that water to kind of make sure that you're fresh. My very last piece of advice is to be flexible with your birth plan. It is so good to research and to know what you want out of your whole entire process, but it's also really good not to doubt yourself or not to like discredit yourself if your birth doesn't go according to plan. At the end of the day, if you're able to deliver your baby and they're healthy, they're happy, everything's okay, everyone's alive, then everything is good. And that is how your delivery should have gone. As I said, my delivery didn't go quite as expected either. You know, I didn't necessarily want to be induced. I didn't really want that whole route. However, I'm okay. My baby is okay. Everything worked out really, really well. I just think it's really important not to lose sight of the grand scheme of things, because I know sometimes people can get so focused on wanting a certain type of birth, especially if you're wanting to go all natural. But at the end of the day, all that truly matters is that your baby is delivered safely. I hope you guys found this video to be helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments down below. If there's anything else you need clarified or would want clarified, feel free to message me that also. I have no problem making another video like this that's a little bit more in depth than however you may need. Or if you want, you know, my pregnancy experience or advice videos, what I packed in my hospital bag, anything else like that, let me know and I will work on that for you and have it up as soon as I can. Bye.